Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid. I am here with my co-host, Matthew Yglesias, where we meet each week to talk through something we heard that just got under our skin. We've been doing this for a long time, off air. I've been Matt's editor for about a decade, and Matt is still writing and editing and contributing to Grid. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Hey, it's going great. It's I got some coffee. I got my microphone here. It's great to be back podcasting. I'm excited.
Oh, good. I also have a coffee here. So, do you have a bad take?
I do. It's an exciting take. No, this is one of my favorite kinds of takes because it's a little ideologically scrambled. But it comes from Charles Lehman, who is a writer with City Journal and a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a conservative. He's one of my sort of favorite conservative follows, though, because he's like a policy guy. He's a data guy. He cares about facts. And what's interesting is here he was giving a take that I think mostly supports a left position in politics.
Whoa, let's hear it.
But let's explain the whole thing. There's a lot to unpack.
Okay, set it up.
Okay, so there's this test called NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that's done every few years. There is also a sub-NAEP, which is the NAEP long-term test, which is designed to provide comparable results across very long periods of time. The latest long-term NAEP for fourth graders came out at the beginning of September, and it showed for the first time in a very long time that fourth graders' math and reading scores went down. And they went down a lot because NAEP scores had been going up consistently, but very, very slowly, throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and they slid back, giving up decades worth of gains. That was obviously related to the COVID-19 pandemic, which people may have heard of.
I heard of that one, yeah.
Yeah, it was a thing.
But what the backslide is these kids weren't in school. Right, so you're talking school closures.
So most of the discourse was that, okay, this shows how bad the school closures were. School closures, of course, were mostly pushed by Democratic governors, by sort of left-wing writers, by teachers' unions who are associated with the left. So Charles was saying, he wrote on Twitter, it's an unpopular view on here, but my guess remains that COVID learning loss will fade out such that COVID cohorts will substantially resemble their pre- and post-COVID peers by the time they leave school. So it's not to say that Charles was all in on the lockdowns. I don't actually know what his view about COVID was. But he's essentially saying there that, the school shutdown people, that the left-wing people who said this would be okay are right, and that ultimately the learning loss is going to be a kind of bump in the road, but that the kids will catch up by the time they leave school. And I hope that he is right. I mean, as an American, I hope that he's right. I thought that the school closures were wrong, but I'm not super invested in being vindicated in that stance. I want to see good things happen to the country. I'm the parent of a public school child. I think I see a lot of lingering problems related to the shutdowns. So I hope that he's right, but I don't think that he is. My sense is that the bulk of the evidence really goes in the opposite direction. And I think we're going to have a problem here, whose results kind of bounce forward for decades.
So I feel the same. It would be great if that's the outcome, where kids just get caught up over time. But it seems to me, based on everything we know about kids being out of school or missing school, that they have to make up that time, that the way that you make up lost learning is by spending more time learning, that you can't it doesn't just happen by, I don't know, magic or osmosis, that you got to help kids get caught up, that they're not going to get better at reading year over year, but to really get out of a hole, you have to invest time and effort. And we know this. We've seen it. I mean, you see it just, I think of even on a small scale, when kids come back from summer vacation, there's evidence about learning loss, of kids backslide when they've been out of school for a while, and you've got to get them caught back up and get going again. and that outcome is worse for kids at the lower end of the economic spectrum, that parents who maybe were sending their kids to some type of summer school or some type of educational summer camp, that those kids are doing better than the kids who maybe were home by themselves or just were not engaged in the same way. And we know that. And that's at a fairly low level. One of the saddest examples I can think of, it was a really compelling story in The Atlantic a few years ago now. It was the 10th anniversary of Katrina. And there's been research done on what happened to those kids who missed a year or more of school. And the pile-on effects on their lives is just extraordinary. You look at high school graduation rates, college graduation rates, joblessness, employment. It really affected a generation of kids who were behind, and they just didn't get caught up, that there was no systematic investment in these kids and they didn't get caught up. So now we're looking at this at a national level. It just doesn't make sense to me that it would be different than these other situations.
Yeah, I mean, and even the Katrina one, is interesting because there's some Hurricane Katrina generated a lot of interesting research papers as well as human tragedy. And there were some kind of like good things that came out of it, actually. I mean, there's papers about, families that wound up moving to Houston after Katrina. And that turned out to be good for them because there are just stronger economic opportunities in Houston than in New Orleans. They made really big changes to how the New Orleans school system functions in the wake of Katrina. And people disagree about this. It's a little controversial, but I think the bulk of the evidence is that those changes were changes for the better. But in the context of all that, you have what you say, which is that, there was just a clear big blow to these kids. That was why, this all started, it was spring of 2000. I wrote my first piece about school closures before it was such a partisan issue. You were my editor. I think you forgot this article because I don't know.
Wait, what year was this? You said, did you just say 2000? Are you talking 20? Wait, what year was this?
2020. Sorry, not 2000. We were in college.
That was way. You were way ahead of the curve on that.
2020.
2020 or so. Yeah.
Okay, so coincidentally, I was researching summer learning loss for my book, and then this pandemic came. So I was sort of hip to the problem here, and you see just a lot of evidence that higher socioeconomic status families kind of make their kids continue to do at least like school adjacent stuff over the summer. And working class families tend not to. So you see losses for sort of, both kinds of kids, but especially for lower income kids. Also, especially in math, right? Because, bougie parents like me, we kind of like make our kids keep practicing reading, but you gotta
No, but you know what? As the daughter of a community college math instructor, math all year, measuring stuff, doing stuff.
Right.
But it was odd, unusual.
Very few parents are sufficient hard asses to do. I mean,
I'm definitely an outlier here doing my math.
That's like Tiger Mom kind of shit. So I don't know. A whole year gone, I think it's hard to make up. So I thought it was interesting to get this take from a conservative, though, because I think that this helps reset what the whole conversation is, right? Which is that during the course of the pandemic, it became the case that being really worried about COVID was a left-wing thing. So closing schools became a left-wing thing. So criticizing school closures became a right-wing thing. So hyping up learning loss became a right-wing thing. What Charles's tweet is illustrating is the reassertion of the historic pattern, which is that progressive people believe a lot in the value of schools. And they think that schooling, like time spent in school, hands-on time from teachers, makes a really big difference. And conservatives don't. Brian Kaplan is an economist at George Mason, who I've known for years. He had an op-ed in the New York Times recently putting forward his thesis that school is just a waste of time and money.
We discussed that as a possible...
Yeah.
That was a nomination for this podcast, Bad Takes.
I mean, he has an extreme version of this take, but it's like a normal right-of-center opinion is to say something like, look, like kids are just kind of reaching their natural potential over time. And school is epiphenomenal. And all this stuff, all this money, all this time spent is at best a kind of childcare service to parents. At worst has no real sort of impact on long-term outcomes. And, I mean, it's hard to sort of prove or disprove really fundamental issues on that sense. But to me, COVID has demonstrated how wrong that is, right? That what education pessimists get right is that it is very hard to find highly effective education policy interventions that work at large scale. Right? Most things that are like, maybe we should give kids laptops. Well, it's like, well, that doesn't work, right? Maybe we should have the teachers all stand on their left foot. Well, that doesn't work, right? It's hard to make education a lot better. But when you got a really extreme, really crude intervention.
Yeah. I mean, this was an ultimate experiment, right? Because under normal circumstances, to test out the theory of whether or not school is meaningful, you'd have to have some type of group not go to school, which feels like a risky endeavor. And we had that. We had this widespread case study in what happens when kids of all socioeconomic backgrounds not going to school. So we saw what happened and tested that extreme theory.
And the other thing is that Sarah Mervosh, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name. She's at the New York Times. She did a piece on July 19th looking at what we can tell about sort of education gains since kids returned to school.
Right.
And the conclusion of her piece, based on the researchers she talked to, the test results that are out, is that kids are learning at a normal pace. So far, since school came back, which is good, right? Like we have not derailed.
Right. And there was genuine worry about that if you have kids out of school for a year, are they going to take time to readjust to the environment? Are they going to be able to socially adjust? What kind of mental health issues are you going to face? So it was a good news story that kids are resilient, that they've hopped back into the game, and at a top line level, that was to me a promising sign. That article had a hopeful frame on kids moving forward and learning.
But what this research from NWEA tends to show is that kids are not catching up.
Right.
That it's just as if they missed a year of school and now they're going forward, right? And so in like a super crude sense, you could just this is, I think, like not what we're going to do, but you could just say that everybody who missed a year due to the pandemic needs to do like an extra year of school. I honestly think that we are going to look back on this and say that, separate from whether the schools should have been closed or not, I mean, I have a feeling on that, but we could debate it, that like what we should have done when schools reopened is that everybody should have had to take a re-entry exam. And if you pass the exam, right, if the exam results said, okay, look, you learned a full year's worth of stuff during your year on Zoom school, that's great. And if you didn't, and I think in most cases people wouldn't, you would have to repeat the year.
Right. It makes sense that if you are not ready to advance to the next grade, that, education builds on itself. If you miss second grade math, third grade math, whatever year of math, you're not going to be able to do the next year. But here's the problem, right? So it seems pretty obvious, almost. It just seems obvious. Like, okay, all of these kids have been out of traditional schooling. Let's figure out how to bring them back in an effective way. But it was like a very obvious step was skipped. And I think that this is now getting back to your point about the scrambling of ideology around education during the pandemic, which is to get that step in place, right? It would have needed to come from education advocates on the left, right? There would have had to have been a real push to say, we have to assess these kids. We have to be prepared to put in more resources, to hire more teachers, to be able to have, you're going to have additional teachers to be able to have some kids repeating grades. You just are. And that did not happen. And I can't assign motivation purely on sort of politics, but the political stakes of that are tough if you are a blue state mayor or governor, because you'd have to say, hey, my policy of keeping kids out of school has probably had damaging effects. We should measure those damaging effects and try to correct them by spending a lot of money. Is not, who wants to say that? Who wants to be in that position?
Well, but it's worse than that, right? I mean, because there was this view. I mean, the way you measure something like learning loss is you give people tests, right? Like anything we are going to say about how much learning loss was there during the pandemic, how much catch up have children done, was Charles ultimately vindicated, right? Like 5-10 years from now, we're going to look back and say, was he right?
Right. You and I are basing this conversation on testing, that we're saying you got to measure where kids are and compare it to the past, this whole conversation is based on testing, that you have to have some data to be able to assess this. You just have to, fundamentally, you have to believe that testing has value.
Well, that's right, because that's the thing. Because, I'm a parent, so I have, I think, a very fine-grained and nuanced understanding of, like, my son's level of reading ability. And I can tell you that, when you reduce that to a test, it does not fully capture what's going on. He has peers who I know quite well, and it's the same thing. I mean, I could really describe to you with nuance where these kids are going, and so could their classroom teachers. And a test is a little bit flattening, it's a little bit simplistic, it's a little bit limited. At the same time, as a journalist, if I'm going to make like an assertion about like what happened in the school system in all of Ohio, it's like, well, you can't interview every child at length over a period of years. The tests summarize. Yeah.
Right. And I hate to say this to you, Matt, but I know that to you and to me, Jose is special. He is a special boy. Other people's kids maybe aren't so special. I mean, that lots
right.
of kids are actually very similar at similar ages, and that if you give them all the same test, even though it feels like your child's, nuanced personality and strengths and weaknesses are unique to him, that actually the flattening is happening across the board.
Well, and that's the point. With a statistical survey, right? It averages out.
Yeah, that it's okay. Maybe your individual child would score better on some other type of reading test, but we're just going to assume that by having a large pool of kids taking this test, that we can, it gives us good enough, valuable information nonetheless.
But here we got so this was from back fall 2021, Cicely Meyer-Cruz, who's the head of the Teachers Union in Los Angeles, she uncorked, I think, one of the worst takes of all time. And she says, there's no such thing as learning loss. Our kids didn't lose anything. It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They learned resilience. They learned survival.
Oh, yeah. I remember
They learned critical thinking skills.
Yeah,
they know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup. And, that's not true.
You can't, yes, children did not sit in the dark for a year. That certainly humanity marched forward in different ways. But when we're talking about learning loss, the definition I'm using here is, are kids performing academically where they should based on their age? So, if you're 9, are you academically in the 4th grade, or really are you in the 3rd or the 2nd? And that's what we're talking about. So, and then moving that conversation, not even being willing to engage with the question. I mean, she's the head of the largest or second largest teachers union in America. And the answer to learning loss is to kind of change the subject, essentially, is pretty telling.
Well, also, I mean, look, again, make this all about my beautiful, unique snowflake child. I mean, it is true that over the course of the pandemic year, right, like the kids I know, they learned that we thought that, peaceful protesting was good, and that the violent mob that stormed the Capitol was bad.
But wouldn't they have learned that if they were in school anyway?
Well, yes. But also there's a difference between, you can sort of program little kids with these sort of stock phrases. And there's a difference between that and them developing reading abilities that are adequate to first read a kid's book, right? And then read like YA books. And then eventually you want them to be grown-ups who can read real works of history and politics, right?
Well, I would also say this. Let's entertain the idea that kids made up for one type of learning in another way. We know that behavior problems are on the rise, that there are more disturbances in schools and classrooms than pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that advocates for kids' social welfare are really concerned. We saw ER doctors. There was some ER study that came out during the pandemic about fewer kids were being seen in the ER, but the kids that were being seen were coming in with far worse injuries, and that doctors were concerned about the social welfare of kids. And there's a lot of indications that not being in school and not being seen by other adults and part of the larger community, larger system, a lot of was being missed. That kids who needed other types of intervention were actually overlooked because they're at home. And so to say, oh, it was great, all these kids who were at home had a really positive experience, I just think we just know that's not true. That we know at the same time, like I think on both sides, that one, that's a disingenuous statement about what learning loss means. And two, this idea that everybody was going to a peaceful protest, with their parents and everything was great, is just not true. We just know that. And so I don't know. I'm getting upset. Like, that's a very upsetting thing to hear from somebody in that position. So we know that kids have been hurt by this on a lot of levels. And, why is somebody like the head of a teachers union not saying, I represent, and I believe that many, many teachers in that union are ready to go into battle, like ready to see these kids again and want to help them and want to get them up to speed and are worried about what happened to them when they didn't see them for a year. So it's just like, this is so out of touch with reality.
I mean, I also just want to say that, like, I don't think it makes sense to posit this kind of dichotomy between, learning about like social and cultural and political topics and the kind of like 3 R's, basic reading, writing, arithmetic type skills, so like
writing, the 3 R's. Wait, arithmetic is an R too? I don't know. Anyway, let's refocus the conversation around that, because I'm just saying that is a bad take on multiple levels. Right. But in terms of getting back to this idea of how to get kids caught up, where is the buy-in from the people who should be advocating for this? And I think it gets back to our conversation around testing, that we are saying this conversation is based on testing, that there's valuable information in the test scores that tell us something about learning. And what the comment we just talked about was saying kind of disregarded testing, right? That this is there's a bigger picture issue here with testing itself, that the unions would have to say testing is good to be able to say, that there's a value to testing, when for many years there's been a push against testing in different corners of education policy.
So then the other thing that has happened here, right, is the Biden administration, as part of the American Rescue Plan, made a lot of additional financial resources available to school districts to sort of help them reopen and help them cope with this stuff. There's a provision that says 20% of the money has to be used to address learning loss and catch up. Thomas Kane, who's a education policy researcher at Harvard, he has some good like back of the envelope math on this, which is like how many weeks of instruction were lost versus how much money is this. And he just points out that like it doesn't add up like on a literal mechanical level.
Oh, he does the money. There was also an interesting formula a writer in the New York Times laid out of calculating how much time you have to put in per point that you've fallen behind. So the more you've fallen behind, it's like 3 weeks a point. So if you're 10 points behind, you've got 30 weeks of extra work to do versus, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a money hole and a time hole to contend with.
The bigger problem with this, Perry Stein, who covered local DC education for a long time for the Washington Post, she's just moved on to a new beat, but did her kind of last piece was a profile of a particular kid at a particular high school in DC. And it seemed like this school was doing like a pretty good job of trying to mobilize resources to get these kids back up to speed. And that this one kid, it seemed like a relatively happy outcome. But what they kept running into was that Dunbar High School is not the only high school in America that was dealing with these problems. And it's not the only high school in America that got this money from the American Rescue Plan. So like the principal's first idea was, I can use the extra money and I can hire extra staff so that I can do longer instructional hours. But every school was dealing with the exact same problems and the exact same influx in funding. So it was actually really hard to just like fill the regular vacancies, right? And so instead of hiring like an extra science teacher, he wound up needing to use the money to replace one of the science teachers he'd already had who didn't want to keep working in the school after Omicron came around. And that's like, this is where macroeconomics is helpful, right? If you gave the amount of money that Dunbar gets just to Dunbar, they would have been able to go out and hire extra teachers, buy extra tutoring services. But there was no, like Joe Biden could not increase the population of experienced high school teachers by 10%.
The other thing is there's already a shortage, right? So it's not that there was a pool of teachers who are unemployed looking for work, but a set pool of teachers already all employed. So you're just feeding from that same pool.
And the other thing the Biden administration did that they're very proud of, I think, for good reasons, is that like the job market in general has been very, very strong. And so I know at our school that last year they had a lot of trouble hiring not like highly skilled teachers, but just kind of like aftercare supervisor, like people.
Yeah, there's different roles in a school, and you can get equivalent type jobs elsewhere potentially.
And Target and Walmart and places like that were really raising wages.
Yeah, wages. Yeah,
because there was a lot of demand. I mean, which is good, like broadly speaking. But schools have been, I don't want to say stuck, but there's like an adding up constraint on the whole economy. Right.
So one thing that was fascinating in this article is great. I mean, it's just, a really great reporter did this piece. And the principal ended up investing in some online tutoring, which I thought I've sort of chuckled of just, oh my gosh, back to Zoom. But it's the only way to scale a tutor, right? Like there's not enough tutors for everybody to sit down with a tutor. So they were, this was sort of a way around that. And it's an acknowledgement of the problem. But you can't just magically find lots and lots of additional people to staff up these positions.
Well, and this was a thing where, high school, right? I mean, you talk about sort of remote learning and tutoring and technology, right? These things are so differentiated by age and also by kind of like who the kids are, right? I mean, if you imagine a high school age student, that's somebody who just like has the capacity, right? Like mentally and physically to log on to a Zoom and receive instruction over the internet. Then the question is, well, does the kid have the motivation? Right? Like there are 15-year-olds in the United States who are really, really, they're probably smart. They probably come from like middle-class families and they're like really worried about their college applications. Right? And they, given a good online tutor, will like buckle in and learn a lot. Then you have kids who, for whatever reason, they're struggling with different kinds of problems, having trouble staying focused. Maybe they're just like, they're not that into school. They're not that kind of focused on this. And they could benefit in theory a lot from tutoring, but they could also just kind of tune it out. I was like pretty good at school, but I'm like pretty bad at exercising. And so I do way better if there's like an in-person class or a trainer or something like that.
Please. I know.
Not because it's like impossible to watch a YouTube and be like, just pick up the fucking weight, but like it's motivating to have somebody who's there in person.
Well, and also learning itself, you learn. So both of my parents are retired teachers. And one time I was I don't know what I was complaining about, any number of things. And my dad made the point, which I had never thought about as a student, which was that being in a classroom itself is helpful because you're learning from other students. You're watching somebody else do something, or you're interacting in a way that the actual classroom itself and the way that teaching works with a group is really effective. And it's different than sitting home alone with a book or staring at a screen, that it's a different experience and that there's value in and of itself. And I think probably it's not just that you're engaged because the teacher is staring at you, but because that's what, there's a sort of social component to it in a way of, we're all sitting here doing this together, and it's a kind of expectation setting.
Well, and again, I always urge people, we don't have comprehensive demographics on the audience of our podcast, but, the kind of people who listen to these shows or who read Grid or, read my newsletter tend to be people who were like above average at school, right? And it's always worth, if you're somebody who was like that, thinking about the value you get out of, say, an in-person yoga class, right?
Yes.
Or something else, right? Where, as you're saying, right, you see people who are more experienced than you, or frankly, just more talented than you, and you copy them, right? Like you learn from them. I think the internet is just great for people who are really good at whatever it is you're doing, right? For autodidacts.
I would also say, I don't know. I guess Peloton's over. I don't know. But Peloton, when I was, COVID glamping and doing Peloton, it's a race, right? And you see yourself on a board and et cetera. I don't need to necessarily be next to someone physically to have that same motivating thing going on of there's like a little bit of competition happening and, there's person. So, but yoga, yes, for sure. Because I don't want to, I don't know. I have some self-respect. I don't want to look like I gave up during class. It's just like, it's the teacher. It's also I'm in the class. And also I know that I appreciate it when the person next to me is trying hard. It's like, I'm going to try hard, So one thing I do want to get back to, though, with this article that I thought was both inspiring but also tough is that here's a principal who got really creative and identified a problem and was looking at these, I think, sophomores, talked to every sophomore, and kind of got a sense of where each student was. And this specific student really he's doing quite well. And part of it, he was kind of one of these bubble students that teachers say of, he could go either way, right? He could totally disengage and kind of fall off the radar. And, he's not a troublemaker. He just falls between the cracks. Instead, the principal said, okay, we're going to make a concerted effort to create a program for him to succeed. And, so he starts going, it turns out he was really into building stuff during the pandemic and he's interested in electronics. So he joins the robotics club. He finds a mentor in the head of the club. He makes a friend in that robotics club. He starts to do tutoring. He's more engaged in school. And what was so great is that it was specialized to him, because I know I was making fun of you earlier with, your, one child being a snowflake, but it's true that people have different interests and different motivators. And so for him, it just seems really, and he also had parents who were willing to take him to school and make sure he got to school on Saturdays. So he's going to, he had a lot of factors playing into his success, and it was just this individualized interest in him. And that's a lot. It takes a lot, to have individual interest in every single kid. And what if you go to a school where you don't have a creative principal who's saying, okay, I've got this money and what am I going to do with it? In this case, the principal was saying, I want to figure out what individual kids need, probably also looking at it collectively as well, right? Of, okay, what are common themes and patterns? But, that's a really great educator. And not every school is going to have that. So how do you scale that is what was going through my mind as I was reading it. Of this is a really cool individual story, but how do you scale that?
I mean, that's I thought, to start with Charles's take, I mean, I think that kind of, edu skepticism is wrong. But what is right is that it's really hard to map out easily scalable interventions that, again, if this high school were the only high school in the city, you could see what was succeeding, you could see what didn't succeed, and you could map out a strategy to make it work, right? Because it really did just come down to compensating for the lost time by providing extra time, by finding things that the kids were interested in, creating Saturday programming for them, creating after-school programming for them, and having them do more stuff. But how do you do more stuff in every school, in every city in America, right?
Okay, I think this is a good point. And I think it's going to segue into the rest of our conversation. So maybe we could take a little break here.
Oh, yeah,
and then
we're overdue.
Circle back. We're overdue for a break. Okay, let's take one. Matt, before the break, you were just talking about scale. And that's the question, right? How do you scale this? There's my question of individual schools and teachers and principals. And then to your point, the macroeconomic problem here of we've got a tight labor market. There aren't extra teachers. So, we're looking at this money, what is the hopeful case for this? Is there a hopeful case for this, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite pessimistic on the aggregates because, what you need is for every school to, you can do more after school programming. You can do more tutoring. You can extend the school year, right? I mean, if everybody's summer vacations got 2 weeks shorter and then they sustained that for 7 years, that would make up a lot of lost schooling. So you can do that different ways, right? You can hire additional staff. You can pay teachers to do overtime work, et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard for every school to do that because it's like, where did the people come from? Now, I would definitely say, look, if you have this extra money in your pocket and you have existing staff in the building who would like to work additional hours for additional money, you should absolutely go do that, right? Like that is the thing you can do that extends the amount of instruction you're offering that isn't just poaching instructors from other places.
Right. It's actually additive, sure.
But I mean, I just think that like we should be realistic as a country that like while many schools I think will succeed in deploying these resources to get their kids extra instructional time, it's going to be really hard to do that as an aggregate. Right? It's that like some schools and some districts are going to hoard the labor.
Yes. So that's the other thing is that the concentration of disadvantage is the other thing that you're going to look at schools where maybe, so we have these aggregate numbers, but some schools where, you've got most kids are, I don't know, the equivalent of a few weeks behind in, needing to make up work, that they need to put in a couple more weeks on top of their normal learning to catch up. But the data shows, we don't have data on economic background or financial background or parental profession, but we have racial data, and we're seeing that, Black students were really hit hard with school closures. So you're going to have, schools that are going to struggle the most in getting their kids up to speed. Also, they need a lot. It's not just equally spread out over all of the schools where you're going to need to figure out, okay, each school needs to have a certain percentage of teachers who you pay more to stay longer, et cetera. That doesn't work in a school where you need so much.
Right. I mean, the other thing that I think is sort of important here, I mean, you were mentioning the sort of racial disparities that have been widely discussed here, but I'm always like frustrated by that, because like that's the data that we have at hand is they write down the race of the different students, and they don't write down like what's your parents' job, and that kind of thing. And I bet that if we looked at it in a detailed way, that's what was driving the disparate learning loss, that some people, were working from home while their kids were home from school and were able to give them, in effect, extra instructional hour, and other people were just kind of, were doing their jobs in person. And I think like one really bad thing that could happen is if people like trying to be sympathetic, to be like, aha, it's the worst off who suffered, are going to create a dynamic where a lot of people are like, this doesn't affect me, right? But everybody like went down, right? And like we all have an interest in finding a way to get more instructional time, not just in like one specific school, but in schools in general. And I think there is a lot of money in the system, which is good. I think we're going to need more money.
Well,
let's
back up. But, it's not, no, it's not in general. There's just concentrations of schools that are going to need more resources. And It's not because I suspect that the common denominator would be, did your parent have to physically go to work or not, is going to be would be a big factor, right? That Zoom school only works if you have an adult physically there, making sure, kids are engaged. But the reality is, we also know that the way, makeup of schools in America are not evenly racially distributed. So we know that there are just, the point being, I'm not suggesting we say, we make this a question of it's not a cause and effect. I'm just pointing out that there are going to be schools where they need a lot more, and it's not a generalized problem. And schools that need less are probably going to be in a better position anyway to catch up their kids. So I think it would be good if we didn't widen the gap that already exists. And, maybe we're talking about a semantic difference about how do you talk about and sell a nationwide or statewide or, district-wide program versus how you measure need kind of in the weeds of the policy or of the program. But I think, maybe it's a semantic difference is what we're talking about here. It's just, I'm pointing out the reality, and I think it makes it even harder.
But I was saying, I think that we need to think about ways to increase the total volume of not just money, right, but like actual like human instructional resources that are available to the school system, right? So like one thing with this tutoring, right, is that it creates a kind of like loophole around teacher licensing rules.
Right. So you can you can get people licensed to be a tutor, essentially, or you can hire a tutor much faster than you can hire a teacher.
Yes.
But apparently even that in DC has been hard because there's a backlog. You have to go through whatever the system is that you would normally have to get through to do this type of work. That hasn't been increased. So you got to speed, like the infrastructure around it to speed up, let's get more people on the ground also needs to be sped up. The kind of the process of running background checks, et cetera, to get people in. But that to me is it's an important detail. But to your point of, okay, maybe we can't certify lots and lots of new teachers quickly, but maybe we can get more tutors in the door. That would be great.
Right. It's that's what you need, right? And we need to take it. I mean, we need to work on the logistics, and I think we need to work on it as a kind of a whole of society thing, right? Like, can we get a program to get, like retired people to spend a few hours a week as reading tutors for little kids, right? College students, right? Like what can we do to get more human beings who have above average levels of educational attainment to do some work with kids who need some help with reading and math?
Well, and you're not taking them away from some other, you don't have to woo them away from some other school or some other profession as well that, you're kind of, like we were saying, of paying one teacher more to do more. Or bringing somebody into the system who wasn't there before, that these are additive and creating a larger pool to draw from.
You need the spirit of something like, like in World War II, it was like everybody needs to have like a victory garden, right? Like, and it's not like we didn't have farms or stuff like that, but it was like we needed more. We needed more labor into these things. And we need to recognize that this is something of a state of emergency, that like schools can't just go hire another teacher because that teacher would come from another school.
Right. You're just, the balloon is just, you just squish it one way, it goes the other way.
We need more people to be available. And that means acknowledging, though, right? I mean, going back to our teachers union and our conservative pundit, it means like telling society that there's actually a serious issue here and that we would like something fairly dramatic to happen, in terms of like people who have not previously been engaged with educating students, to not substitute for what teachers are doing, but to complement it to help us achieve some measure of catch up and prevent this from being a thing where, we have a fascinating paper 80 years from now showing like a whole cohort of kids who were derailed and the economy steps back.
Right. And it needs to be a call to pitch in. And that's, where that gets back to our kind of scrambled political ideology here that I think is too bad that we don't have strong voices in teachers unions or other sort of establishment advocates pushing for this. The other problem, I guess, my last point on this is that we do need to also, at the same time this is happening, teachers have been quitting in higher numbers than we've seen before. And so we have to shore that up as well, of making long-term, the profession itself more attractive to more people, because, that's been a problem. I think that's been a problem for a long time, and it's just been exacerbated during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that one could say about that sort of like teacher supply and the way the compensation structure for teachers works. It makes it sort of unappealing for people to try out, especially if you're not like 100% committed to doing it for your whole career, which winds up leaving a lot of people kind of off the table. Our personal podcast version of Learning Loss is that we did our mid-roll ad break late in the episode, so we're a little unbalanced. But it's a relatively new show, and we are making up for lost time ourselves, and we'll do better in the future.
I think we're gonna leave it there.
Okay, yeah.
We both agree that kids aren't gonna just magically catch up. We could really use a victory garden approach to getting kids caught up. And, maybe next week I'll bring the bad take. We'll see.
So Bad Take, Charles Lehman. Okay, so Bad Takes is a production of Grid. I'm Matthew Yglesias. Co-host is Laura McGann. The Producer of Bad Takes is Olivia Reingold. If you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Give us high ratings on Apple and other kind of podcast apps like that. Podcasts spread really through word of mouth, and we're hoping to make this good and get it out in front of people. So thanks to everybody for listening, and come back next week for more Bad Takes.